Good afternoon, everybody. It is Tuesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined today for an emergency Steelers free agency video by Brian Batko, our Steelers beat reporter. Brian, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm in my new little office that the wife made for me at home. So new background with a fantasy basketball league championship banner, a map over my left shoulder. Just great vibes up here.
Absolutely. I should try to figure out a way to incorporate my fantasy football championship this year into my setup.
Well, first you have to be
Been
nerdy and goofy enough to have a league that makes its own banner. But yeah, congrats to you on that victory, Adam. And time for is emergency podcast. Is that an overused phrase, you think, in the 2023 media world?
Perhaps. I guess we should have probably planned to do this anyway, but we didn't necessarily have plans on the books until yesterday when Patrick Peterson signed with the Steelers, replacing Cam Sutton as kind of that number one corner for this franchise. There was a lot of angst early in the day, Brian, when Cam Sutton went to Detroit on a $33 million deal, $11 million per year, with Detroit, and then all of a sudden in the afternoon, I was out picking up groceries, and like a thunderclap, Patrick Peterson finally came to the Steelers. This is something we talked about for years. I think you retweeted today. There was Santonio Holmes had tweeted about Patrick Peterson, or not Santonio Holmes, Antonio Brown, excuse me, had tweeted about Patrick Peterson coming to the Steelers 5 years ago, kind of when he was probably closer to his potential future Hall of Fame prime.
And now Antonio Brown was very close to the end of his Steelers career, as it turned out, but that's a chat for another day.
Yeah. So, but now he's finally here. So what is the calculus here? If you're weighing losing Cam Sutton, gaining Patrick Peterson, what does that trade effectively, what does that measure up to with the Steelers?
I think on the Post-Gazette website right now, we've got 4 stories with Patrick Peterson in the headline. Actually, I guess when we post this video, that'll make it 5. So we really have this covered from all angles, I think. Ray Fittipaldo did a great X's and O's analysis, pointing out what a lot of people did when this move was made early Monday evening, that he's an outside corner. This isn't a player who gives you the same kind of versatility that Cam Sutton did, but to be fair, not many corners in the NFL give you the same kind of versatility that Cam Sutton did, which is why there are still a lot of Steelers fans, even here on Tuesday, that I'm seeing who aren't really happy that they let him walk to Detroit for, a good bit of money for him, but not anything too exorbitant. They probably could have found a way to make that work if they wanted to. My initial reaction to letting Cam Sutton leave was, he's 28 now. The Steelers must think he's going to fall off a cliff physically. And yet they go out there and acquire a corner who is 5 years older, just about. So I guess there's not any concern that Pat Pete, as the cool kids call him, I guess there's no concern that he can't run anymore. They're looking at what he did last season, where if you're into like the PFF grades, I think he was an 81, maybe to Cam Sutton 72, somewhere around there. So still playing at a high level, but you look at the Joe Hayden situation this time last year. If you're the Steelers or any other team, would you rather be a year late on a guy at corner losing it, or would you rather be a year early? Maybe they were a year early letting Joe Hayden go. Nobody else ended up snapping him up either, and now they're going to kind of hope that Peterson can keep it going. Although, as Ray also mentioned in his piece, it's effectively a 1-year deal. It's one of those classic backloaded Steelers contracts that sets you up for kind of a win-win. If he plays really well in 2023, then you've got him under contract for another year. If he doesn't, you move on with minimal dead money, and you chalk that up to a guy on his last leg. So we'll see what happens. Jerry Dulac also wrote a good piece too that's more of a commentary on it, and I think he makes a good point that and he makes this point at the end, but this was one of my first thoughts, was this feels like a Mike Tomlin push here. I mean, he's spoken highly of Peterson over the years in pressers when the Steelers have played against him. He loves the guys with pedigree. We know he tracks them all at the big pro days. He's out at Clemson right now. You can't get all of those players who go top 10 in the draft, but he loves circling back on former first-round picks, particularly on defense. This is yet another one here with Pat Pete.
Yeah, I think that connection has been very obvious. Brian, is the versatility the only obvious thing that the Steelers are losing in going from Cam Sutton to Patrick Peterson? You mentioned that Peterson's grades are pretty good on the outside, so it doesn't seem like they're losing a lot in that realm. Is it mostly the versatility and the ability to move a guy around the defense?
Yeah, I think so, and just the familiarity or sure thing, whatever you want to call it, with the defense. I mean, I would assume that a player of Patrick Peterson's caliber will be able to plug in seamlessly and do whatever they ask him to do in this defense. He'll be able to, understand what they're putting down schematically. But you knew that Sutton had it inside and out. That's why he was able to play so many different positions. He'd been here since 2017. Obviously had a good working relationship and on-field chemistry with players like Minkah Fitzpatrick, like Levi Wallace. So that's the other part of it too, that there was, I'm sure, some comfort in bringing him back, but clearly the Steelers had a number set in their head, or maybe the principled franchise philosophies of guaranteed money, and they were not going to do that. I'm sure it was a difficult discussion for Omar Khan to have, but plenty of former players have talked about his ability to kind of be real with you, be the bad cop sometimes when necessary, and maybe that's ultimately how it went down with Sutton, and his agent said, look, if you guys aren't going to do this for us, we're going to go somewhere that will. And I was surprised by it, and I think a lot of fans were, a lot of media were too. Most people just assumed that it was going to be a formality. Those two sides would find a way to reach an agreement and continue on what had been a 6-year career to this point. But now he goes to the Lions, and it's probably better positioned to make a run at winning big in the NFC than the gauntlet that is the AFC right now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, it doesn't seem like you see $11 million a year as an overpay. I've seen some people say that seems like a lot of money for Cam Sutton. What's your take on the value of the contract and whether he might have been worth that amount of money to the Steelers?
You can't look at it in a vacuum. The salary cap has gone up. The Steelers situation has changed drastically when you look at the money they are no longer paying to Ben Roethlisberger. We've heard Omar Khan and even Mike Tomlin talk a lot about the flexibility that gives you in terms of managing the cap when you don't have a high-priced veteran quarterback. So is there another shoe to drop that they make good use of that added wiggle room? Maybe an Alex Highsmith contract extension, maybe a splashy free agent signing that none of us are anticipating. I'll note that news could be happening, while we record this, while you're listening to this. Day 2 of free agency last year, I believe, is when the Steelers went out and got James Daniels, who, as we know, became the highest priced outside signing for the Steelers in this first wave of free agency in team history. And that's kind of a natural trend. That's going to go up every year. Every team has more money to spend as the revenues rise, particularly from the COVID squeeze a couple years ago. I mean, when Mike Hilton signed with the Bengals for $24 million over 4 years, it was just the Steelers weren't really in a position to match that. They were so up against it. Kevin Colbert even said that going into free agency that year. We know that Bud Dupree got just crazy money that the Titans haven't even been able to sustain. They had to cut him. Javon Hargrave cashing in on another deal that was ultimately bad, timing for the Steelers with the Stephon Tuitt situation that nobody could have expected. So, this is a little different to me. I don't think this is purely a financial decision by the Steelers. I think it's also just a matter of, say what you want. I mean, they will say nice things about Cam Sutton. He will say nice things about the Steelers, but the fact of it is they didn't think he was worth what other teams think he was worth. I don't really see how that can be anything other than a commentary on the quality of the player himself when you're not one of these teams that is just buried in the red.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask Brian is, now you mentioned that flexibility. I think we now know the terms. It's close to $7 million a year for Patrick Peterson for these 2 years. Not a lot of guaranteed money. Do you think it's possible that the net, if the Steelers go out and sign someone else for $4 million, or they sign someone's for $2 million each, whatever combination they decide to use that $4 million, that net package is better for the team in the big picture, than simply having Cam Sutton.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying that I dislike this swap for the Steelers. I don't love it. I don't hate it. I'm neutral. I know that that's not really a, a fun place to be in the hot take society, but it also remains to be seen how the rest of this roster takes shape. I think when you look at it as Patrick Peterson is a player who comes considerably cheaper with less guarantees and is somebody who very arguably was a better player than Sutton last year, albeit in a slightly different role. There's reason to think it's a slam dunk move for the Steelers. But we just kind of went over all the reasons why it could be more or less paying for past performance than what you're going to get out of that guy in the future. So, we'll see how this shapes up if it allows them to spend a little bit more on, say, an inside linebacker, or, can you give that to Larry Ogunjobi to keep your defensive line more or less intact? Those would be two areas that I'd initially look to shift the dollars, or possibly safety next to Minkah Fitzpatrick. But yeah, there are still many dominoes to fall. This is the first piece of it, one that I didn't see coming. I don't think anybody who speculates or pontificates or educated guess work on these things did. I don't know that Patrick Peterson was on any of the list of potential options for the Steelers. They generally don't sign players who are this old in free agency. Now, maybe he's a modern marvel in terms of how hard he works and the shape that he's kept himself in, and he's just the genes he has are freakish, which is why you're a top 10 pick or whatever he was, close to it. But it came out of left field for him, as he said on his podcast, and I think it did for a lot of us here too.
Brian, I think you and I are both 32, right?
I'm 31. Yeah, don't
okay.
Don't rush me into that
we're
good
about
night.
Patrick Peterson's age, doesn't it? It's a little rough that we're talking about him this way, isn't it?
Well, we don't play corner in the National Football League, Adam. So the other part of this too that I think is maybe overblown a little bit is this guy's going to be a great veteran mentor to whatever rookie they bring here. Maybe it's still a first round pick at number 17. Maybe it's a guy at 32. Maybe it's Joey Porter Jr. I agree with that. I mean, I think there's something to be said for one of the best, pure outside corners, ball skills guys in the 21st century in the league, taking somebody under his wing. But Cam Sutton was that for a lot of players on this defense. I mean, he was a unquestioned leader on this defense, and he didn't have captain by his name, but a lot of players considered him in that class. So, you're adding a leader type player, but Cam Sutton leaving left a leadership void. So if anything, it's kind of just one out, one in as far as that goes. So maybe they just think that somebody who's been around the block as much as him, if he's going to be sort of the bridge to a young player who is very similar in style, in what's going to be his responsibility in the defense, then that could have been very tempting. And the Steelers do this a lot, right? Like even when Kevin Colbert was running the show as the GM, very common to see, we're going to sign Dante Moncrief is in a tier well below Patrick Peterson, but it's an outside free agent signing. Let's sign him. Then let's go draft Deontay Johnson. One will work out, whether it's the older guy or the younger guy. I mean, even last year, a quarterback signed Mitch Trubisky didn't preclude them from drafting a quarterback in the first round in Kenny Pickett. So I think that could still very well be the case. Maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here with what else is on the topic sheet to talk about this.
Well, I think that segues well. I did want to get into, how does this impact the draft? I think if they had brought back Cam Sutton, I think you're looking at that more as a long-term, like he's probably going to be here for 3 years type of deal. You mentioned at the top of the show that this Patrick Peterson thing could turn out to be 1 year. And so I think you have a little less long-term definition from, the veteran guy you have there than you would have had if you had Cam Sutton. So does that put more pressure on Omar Khan to say, all right, I got to get a corner in this draft, whether it's one of those top 3 guys we've been talking about a lot, Joey Porter Jr. probably being the biggest name of those, or someone further down in the draft order if those guys all go in the top 10 or top 15?
Not necessarily, because I think if Sutton were the guy returning rather than Peterson coming in from the outside, that you trust him as an inside corner playing that slot role, kind of opens up more possibilities to best player available, best corner. available, unless there's a plan for Peterson that we aren't privy to at this point, that he's all of a sudden going to remake himself as a passing down slot corner, and then it makes all the sense in the world to get another young guy to play opposite Levi Wallace. Like, I really like Levi Wallace. Maybe the Steelers aren't as high on him as I am. Like, I'm penciling him in as a week 1 starter for sure. I think he is a fine number 2 corner in the league, and for a defense that is so built on rushing the passer, and now with the, arguably the best center fielder in the league at safety in Minkah Fitzpatrick, you don't necessarily need a lockdown corner on one side. Now, I think drafting that guy could certainly help. That could be a market inefficiency to have all of those things in one formula. But I could see it going either way now. I mean, you've got a couple guys who are pretty reliable on the outside. I don't know what you do in the slot now. I mean, Arthur Millette clearly isn't somebody that they think is every down capable, the way that Mike Hilton was by the end of his tenure, the way that Cam Sutton was. So it could open up even another need now in the cornerback or secondary realm, however you want to look at it. But still think it could make sense to go get a Joey Porter or Keely Ringo at 17. Then you don't have to throw that person into the fire. You can let him kind of ascend to that role if Peterson or Levi Wallace is struggling, and you can go from there. One guy that probably even more so now, the odd man out, would be Akella Witherspoon, and I don't know why he wouldn't be after the struggles that he had in 2022.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the mock drafts do this week. I do the mock draft tracker every week on postgazette.com. We'll see how many corners we see. I think maybe this opens up a path, Brian, to maybe some guys that we weren't talking about, maybe in the second, the third, later rounds, who kind of fits that, maybe is a little bit more versatile, kind of like Cam Sutton was, who I believe they got in the third round, right? Maybe you get a guy like that in a later round who can play that role immediately, and maybe develop into being like a Cam Sutton type. I think they have options now, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and that's generally how they set this thing up for themselves going into the draft. Very rarely do they have an obvious hole that pretty much everybody around the league is saying that's going to be their first round pick. I would say running back was probably that a couple years ago, which is why basically everybody was mocking a running back to the Steelers, even when that's no longer in vogue in the first round. But there was just nothing there after the departure of James Conner. It was very, very obvious that Kalen Ballage was not going to be toting the rock on snap one, game one for that team. Even a few years ago, I mean, the Devin Bush, that was another one probably that it was fairly obvious from the makeup of the roster that they were going to go inside linebacker first. But in other years, I mean, they've been able to give themselves players they're confident in just about everywhere. I think the way that Kevin Colbert put it last year was, we feel like we've got starters at 21 of 22 positions. Mind you, Terrell Edmunds was not technically on the team yet at that point, and I think he was acknowledging that they didn't have a starting strong safety. They ended up signing him about a week before the draft. So they always want to go into a draft that way, and they're able to do that now with Peterson as an outside corner.
How much do you think Peterson has left at this point compared to what some people might remember him being at the peak of his career? Is he 80% of the guy? Is he 70% of the guy? Is he maybe 95% of the guy? Considering you mentioned he had the PFF score that was very solid last year. I think I heard on the radio yesterday his passer rating against when targeted was like in the 70s, which is pretty good for a cornerback. What is your measure of him at this stage of his career?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think he's probably still got a lot left in the tank, but these corners can fall precipitously, and it can come without really any warning, I think. Joe Hayden was somebody who I think he was still playing at a fairly high level, but he wasn't the same by the end of it. And as I mentioned earlier, the Steelers kind of pulled the plug pretty quick on that experiment. And now Peterson's even older than Hayden was, but similar in terms of high pedigree players who, were first round immediate plug and play starters for their teams, and, transitioned to a second franchise and continued to ball out. This is now the third team for Peterson. So it's a situation too where I'm very curious because, and Ron Cook brought this up in his column. I've now referenced the stories on our site from Ray, from Jerry, and from Ron on Patrick Peterson. I forgot about Joe Starkey's mailbag. That's in there too. But Ron's column kind of astutely brought up that when free agency, began Monday, the most recent interview that Peterson had done was with Adam Schefter, I think. And he was basically like, I'm trying to win a ring at this point in my career. I'm going to be 33. I want to get with a team like the Bengals or the Cowboys. I forget the third team he mentioned. But he was essentially ring chasing. And then all of a sudden the Steelers enter the picture. I'm sure this will be a topic at his first presser or Zoom or whatever he's going to do when the Steelers announce him, when it becomes official tomorrow. But does he put the Steelers in that class? And I'm sure he'll say yes. I'm sure he'll talk about the young talent. But when he was prompted with the question, when he presumably didn't think the Steelers were an option, or at least not a realistic one, he didn't mention them himself. He didn't throw them out there. He had teams with Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott as their quarterbacks kind of at the top of his list. So is this more of a mercenary money grab by him, or does he really think that the overall situation with highly respected head coach Mike Tomlin, promising young offense, absolute studs on the same defensive unit as him, could lead to that Lombardi trophy that he seeks?
I've said for 2 years, Brian, that I think that the goal once Ben Roethlisberger retired was always to be a good team at the end of this coming season. I think that was my bar for, what is a successful rebuild here is that are you competing not only just to make the playoffs, but can you beat teams when you get there? I don't think it'd be an unreasonable take for him to say, I think the Steelers can beat the Bengals next year. I think the Steelers can beat some of these better teams. Whether you would favor them to do that, I think is an entirely different question. But I don't think it's unreasonable for him to think that they could be at the level where they can win the game. And it's not kind of like it was with that playoff game at Kansas City, 2 years ago when it was clear Ben Roethlisberger didn't have anything left, and that this team didn't have the juice to go into Kansas City and win.
Yeah, I think this could be viewed as a positive for Steeler Nation, that a player at this stage of his career who has made all the money in the world, has all the accolades in the world, and really all he has left to do is chase that carrot of winning the big one, thinks that this is the right place for him. I mean, I'm sure he had other options. Again, maybe it's as simple as the Steelers offered him the most, and money still talks, even when you've made a lot of it. Maybe that was still ultimately the deciding factor for Peterson. But if you want to take a more rose-colored glasses view on it, you could say, look, this is a player who has been around the block and loves our head coach, loves the potential of our defense, thinks that we can be kind of the dark horse in the AFC. Didn't work out the way everybody had it scripted last year, but last year was last year, and that was a trial run with Trubisky, and now Kenny Pickett is the man, and everybody believes in him. So if that's what Peterson has gassed himself up to believe, then you could look at that as a reason for optimism for the rest of this offseason. If you also believe that the Steelers can kind of mess things up here in a conference that most pundits see as Chiefs, Bills, Bengals, and everybody else.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to know is how are the Steelers going to spend? Because I think that I've said this a couple of times on YouTube, so I think it bears repeating now. The thing the Steelers have that those teams don't is that they have money to spend, and they're not in cap hell. The way Cincinnati's lost a couple guys already. The Bengals and the Chiefs are not going to be able to hold on to everyone. Or excuse me, the Bills and the Chiefs are not going to be able to hold on to anyone. That's where the Steelers could find an opportunity. Yeah, that's where the Steelers, I think, could find an opportunity, if not that this year, then the next few. So, Brian, in that context, what do you think is next here? Who is it? A big signing? Is it a small signing? What position are you looking at as saying, hey, this is something that they need to address? As we go into the official start of free agency later than this week, because right now we're in the legal tampering period.
Yeah, I still think that there are players from last year's team who the Steelers are going to negotiate with and potentially bring back. I mean, Larry Ogunjobi would be the biggest, literally and figuratively, if they can find a way for him to come back in the fold. Robert Spillane is somebody who, your mileage on him may vary, but he was a key piece of the defense at the end of last season. Perhaps they're just finally ready to say, we need to upgrade over him. We need to stop having him be the guy who comes in when other, flashier players falter, and then we just plug in old reliable Spillane. And then, beyond that, I don't think it's going to be a huge free agent market for the Steelers. I think they're more positioned to take a run at this thing through the draft and try to absolutely crush these picks at 17, 32, and 49. And maybe you do that at D tackle and inside linebacker, and like we said, still potentially corner, and say this is actually us striking while the iron's hot here, but we're doing it with young players who we have control of for 4 to 5 years, rather than making the moves that we made last season, such as Mason Cole, James Daniels, even re-signing Chuks Okorafor to a contract a lot larger than a lot of us thought he was going to get. So I don't think it's going to all of a sudden blow up for the Steelers here over these next 48 hours. But if you think back to last year, the first week of this free agency period, it was kind of a slow trickle. They went with Trubisky, Okorafor, and Cole on day one. They grabbed Daniels on day two. I think Miles Jack was maybe a Wednesday or Thursday move, and Levi Wallace was somewhere there in between. So, they were pretty busy. I don't think they're going to be that busy this year. Maybe there will be some minor signings at, tight end, running back, O-line depth. And one thing that I think everybody missed, including myself yesterday, Jesse Davis, noted Steelers swing tackle, signed with the Dolphins yesterday. So he will not be back in Pittsburgh. That is no surprise, considering they gave up I think 7th round pick for him last year on cut down day to bring him in from Minnesota. So they do have a depth needed on that unit. I think they'll replenish that through the draft as well. But maybe they've got something up their sleeve. You never know. We're all still kind of feeling out the Omar Khan way of doing things here.
Brian, I'm going to switch topics on you real quick to wrap up. Ben Roethlisberger had Mike Tomlin on his podcast on Monday. I think there's been a lot of talk on the way things ended with Ben Roethlisberger. He mentioned that, my GM and my coach didn't want me anymore. I think our Jerry Dulac reported that there was some bad blood with the organization. But I watched the podcast. I actually wrote a recap of what they talked about on postgazette.com. I'll include a link to that down in the description if anyone wants to check it out. But they seem pretty chummy, Brian. Do you think that Ben Roethlisberger is settling into retirement life here, and that things with the Steelers at this point are copacetic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's like some pain or resentment there that might never go away, but that doesn't mean that you can't, continue relationships with these people and not go full Terry Bradshaw. And then, as far as Tomlin being on the show, agreeing to be on the show and yucking it up with him on stuff. I mean, do you know how many players that Tomlin has probably had to tell over the years that we don't think you can run anymore? We're not doing business with you anymore, but we still appreciate your efforts. I mean, none compare to Ben in terms of stature and legacy, but he's been there, done that. I'm sure it's water under the bridge for the most part. And yeah, I think Ben he was at plenty of games this year. I saw him in the press box several times. So not surprised. I'm sure there's part of you that, maybe will never like the way that it ended, but I guess it's the old forgive, but don't forget type of deal. And everything will be just fine as long as those two guys are. Was Tomlin drinking IPAs on the show, or was he staying above the fray with that?
No, he was sipping. They had the little cups. Ben had a nice big tall pint plus glass in front of him, but Tomlin was sipping on some stuff too. And I love that kind of stuff. I like to see him in those contexts. I think he did a big podcast last year with some former NFL players, and he just really came across as more relaxed in those settings than he is in when we experience him in press conferences and stuff like that. And I think you learn a lot about him. You learn a lot about anyone in these long extended appearances. So I enjoyed it.
Well, we've got now, Ben has his own show, Cam Hayward has his own show, Patrick Peterson has his own show with Bryant McFadden. So if Mike Tomlin wants to continue, getting into those appearances now that he's in his 50s, he's got no shortage of options just from guys that he currently coaches or once coached. So maybe we'll see him in that environment more and more.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's an open invitation for him to join us on the Post-Gazette YouTube page as well.
Yes. And likewise, I'm sure Ben will be beating down our door to come on the Football and Show any day now.
Many people are talking about it, Brian. The Post-Gazette YouTube channel has grown a lot, and we owe all the you viewers for helping us in our first 6 months. I think it's exceeded all of our expectations. So, we may not be getting the huge name guests. We had Cam Hayward on at one point. I think that was a pretty big name, right? But we're growing, and we really appreciate you for that. And if you're just joining us for the first time, please consider popping a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out with the YouTube algorithm, reach more people. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so that you get all of our content. We got plenty of Steelers free agency talk this week with Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive. Also going to be a lot of hoops talk with Pitt, Penn State, West Virginia, all in the NCAA tournament. Try to sprinkle in some Buccos as well. Sometimes it's a little hard with everything going on to get as much baseball talk as we might like at this time of year. But if you're subscribed, you'll get all of that. And of course, check out the subscription deal down in the description. $6 for 6 months of access to post-gazette.com. Everything I'm writing, everything Brian's writing, everything all of our Steelers beat reporters are writing. We've been very busy, I think, in the last 24 hours, Brian. I think we've all written at least twice. So make sure you're signed up to check all of that out. And we'll be back soon. Brian, thanks for joining me today.
Yes. Happy Pi Day, Adam.
Absolutely. Enjoy.
Thanks.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.